Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining and welcome to another session of our Day One and Beyond series, where we take you through various topics and activities related to building out on Oracle Cloud. Today's session will cover getting started with Oracle Cloud infrastructure, including cloud concepts, OCI structures, and core OCI services. OCI service areas that will be discussed include identity and access management, networking, compute, storage, and database. I'd like to introduce Olivia and Joey as the main presenters. And with that, I'll hand it over to Olivia.
Thank you, Taylor. So hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining. So myself and Joey will be taking you through today's session. So we'll be going over the building blocks to getting started with Oracle Cloud Infrastructure, or OCI, and some of the key services. So going over what we will be covering today. So we'll be going over the foundations of OCI, so some of the building blocks to getting started, regions, availability domains, all of that. Then we'll be diving into an overview of some of the different OCI services. So I'll be spending a lot of time on identity access management today. It's a key part of getting started. So how you grant access to your different groups of users or how you get started with working with the different resources in OCI. And then Joey will be taking you through networking, compute, storage, and database, and then we'll have a demonstration at the end. So by the end of this presentation, we hope you will have a comprehension of the building blocks of OCI. So this is regions, availability domains, and fault domains. Also, how to implement security tools like Identity Access Management, or IAM, and some other networking components like virtual cloud networks, gateways, and firewalls. Be familiar with the core OCI services, so networking, compute, storage, and database, and all the different offerings there. All right, so diving into the foundations of OCI to get started. So going over the customer and the cloud service provider responsibility model. So whenever you're in on-prem, you would be responsible for all these different areas here. So the user access, data, application, all the way to the infrastructure and the physical. But as you shift to cloud or OCI, you'll see the model right here. So if you go with infrastructure as a service or IaaS, Oracle would be responsible for the virtualization, network, infrastructure, the physical. And then as you go to more of platform as a service, so maybe Oracle Integration Cloud or something like that, Oracle would be responsible for the guest OS. And then as you go up to SaaS or software as a service, Oracle will be responsible for the application. So you can see the breakdown right here from IaaS to SaaS. And this slide is just an overview of some of the different areas or offerings in OCI, and we'll mainly be focusing today on compute and the different options you have there, storage, networking, and databases. But you can see there's other features to leverage as well. So developer services, containers, functions, AI, all of that. And then at the very bottom, there's also different deployment models. So commercial and government public cloud regions. There's hybrid cloud and dedicated regions. So high level overview, but once again, we'll mainly be focusing on some of the core offerings right here with compute, storage, and networking database. All right, so diving into a key component of working in OCI. So this is regions. So regions are localized geographic areas where you can choose to host your workloads. And these regions are going to be independent of other regions and can be separated by vast distances across countries or even continents. So you can see the breakdown of the regions that we have as of August this year. So you can see the different government ones that we have. You can also see the legend right here. So the Oracle Interconnect for Azure, the Oracle Database at Azure, the Interconnect for Google Cloud, the Oracle Database at Google Cloud. So you can also see how many are planned. And generally, you would deploy an application in the region where it is most heavily used, because using nearby resources is faster than using vast distance resources. However, you can also deploy applications in different regions for maybe to mitigate the risks of region-wide events such as large weather systems, or maybe to meet varying requirements for legal purposes, tax domains, and other business or social criteria. Another reason why regions are important to keep in mind when you're working in OCI. So let's say you can't find a resource. You've checked the first few things that you want to check are your compartment, that you're searching for the resource in the correct compartment, but also searching for the resource in the correct region. So if you ever can't find a resource, search those two places first, but it's also important to keep in mind the region that you're working in. All right, so OCI is hosted in regions and availability domains. So while a region is a localized geographic area, an availability domain contains one or more data centers. And then a region is composed of one or more availability domains. And availability domains, or ADs, are isolated from each other, fault tolerant, and very unlikely to fail simultaneously. And this is because ADs do not share infrastructure such as power or cooling. So that means that a failure at one AD within a region is unlikely to impact the availability of the others within the same region. So you can see we have a Phoenix region right here as an example, and we have 3 ADs here. And within an AD, you have your fault domains, and your fault domains are a grouping of hardware and infrastructure within your AD. And these fault domains let you distribute your instances so that they are not on the same physical hardware within a single availability domain. And also one thing to note is that traffic between availability domains and between regions is going to be encrypted. All right, so going a little bit behind the scenes right here. So to start off with, we've covered regions, your availability domains, and your fault domains. So the availability domains within the same region are connected to each other by a low latency, high bandwidth network, which makes it possible for you to provide high availability connectivity to the internet and on-prem, and to build replicated systems and multiple availability domains for both high availability and disaster recovery. And then on top of that, you have the virtual network. So off-box network virtualization allows us to put all the virtualization out to the network. So it enables the next layer up so that we can take any physical form factor and plug that into our virtual network. And this would increase network performance and security by providing isolation in case of any unforeseen attacks. It would only affect a single virtual network without touching other virtual networks. So this isolated network virtualization is foundational to OCI security, but by no means the only differentiating element. And then lastly, as you can see, the first row shows us the different technologies that are included in your environment. So we're able to use these side by side due to off-box virtualization. So it allows us to plug these into our environment without making any changes. Otherwise, we'd have to bring in a hypervisor on engineered systems like Exadata to make it work. All right, so where do we get started? We have our users that would like to begin their journey in OCI. So to start off with, you would have your tenancy. You would select your region. So you can work in Ashburn or any of the regions that we saw on the slide. And then you also have your availability domains as part of this. All right, so diving into the overview of OCI services. So one thing to keep in mind is the security aspect of working in OCI. So once again, we're going to be spending a lot of time on identity access management today because this is very crucial to getting started because you have role-based policies that would grant access to groups of users for working with your different resources. Otherwise, it's going to be denied by default, so you have to grant that access. So it's very important to keep that in mind as you go. Another key component is compartments. So how are you organizing your different resources, maybe by project, by resource or infrastructure or something like that. We won't really be covering this today, but tagging is also important. So how you're keeping track of your different resources, maybe by environment, prod, dev, or test, or something like that. So this identity piece is foundational, but as you go, you'll be creating different resources. So for data, there's security features or tools to keep in mind, like the Vault service for compute, certificates. And then if you're working on networking, leveraging some of the different features here, like Bastion or Secure VPN. For monitoring and prevention, there's a tool called CloudGuard that would provide different security recommendations to improve your security posture in OCI. The vulnerability scanning service, and also lastly, there's Internet and Edge, so more of web application firewall. So we're going to be diving into this foundational piece, but very important to keep in mind security along the way as you're creating your different resources. All right, so diving into OCI IAM, or Identity Access Management. So this is the somewhat new branding for Oracle Identity Cloud Service, or IDCS. So IDCS has been merged into OCI IAM and adopted the OCI branding. So now we have a single unified identity as a service that includes all the functionality of IDCS, as well as that of our previous version of OCI IAM. And this is just a quick visual of our full IAM portfolio. So you can see the IAM segments where we focus, so strong and adaptive authentication, access management, identity store, lifecycle management, and access governance. And there are two parallel deployment tracks. So right here, you have the Cloud Identity Platform, which includes the OCI IAM service, which is a full-featured identity as a service solution for workforce, consumer, and developer scenarios. And we recently introduced a cloud-native access governance service. And then you also have the traditional Oracle IAM suite, which isn't so traditional anymore. We've addressed issues around deployment complexity and upgrades by making it easy to deploy via Kubernetes and by re-architecting the backend piece by piece using microservices. All right, so when you first get started in OCI, you have your tenancy or your root compartment. So you can see our root compartment is our OCIO BTNAS compartment. And compartments are just a logical way of grouping your different resources. So whenever you create any resource in OCI, so if it's a virtual cloud network, database, or any resource, you have to specify in which compartment it will reside in. So as you go, you'll likely be making different sub-compartments nested up to 6 levels. So maybe you might have a compartment by group or departments like marketing or finance. Then you might have some sub-compartments for infrastructure, shared services, enterprise data. And then once again, as you're creating any of these resources, be it networking, like a VCN, you would specify maybe infrastructure as the compartment that that resource will reside in. Then database may be an enterprise data, maybe your compute instances and enterprise applications. But it's very important to have a compartment structure in place because this is where you'll be creating the different resources too. Another piece of this is policies. So you have policies to grant different groups of users certain levels of permissions for working with the resources in these different compartments. And you can see right here, we have an infrastructure admin group managing the permissions for the resources in this infrastructure compartment. Same for the shared services admin. So they're managing the permissions for this shared services compartment, And then lastly, you might just have a general IAM or identity access management admin group. So it's best practice to have different groups of admins managing access to different compartments or your different resources. And the reason for this is you don't want any overlap or any permissions being granted incorrectly because the infrastructure admin group is going to know the permissions needed for this infrastructure compartment. So same for shared services. So you want to have different groups of admins managing those permissions. So yeah, this kind of just builds off of one of the slides earlier. So once again, we now have a unified IAM service that addresses the needs of OCI, Oracle apps, as well as third-party apps, which may be software as a service or SaaS, might be running in the cloud or on-prem. And the benefits of the identity domains are it's easier identity service management configuration. So instead of setting up different IDCS instances and managing them outside the console, they will now be converted into identity domains accessible via the OCI console. Also, you just have a single entry point. So multiple identity domains are useful when you need to separate environments for a single cloud service or application. So for example, one environment for development, and maybe you have one for production. So who gets access? So when you're granting access, you're always granting it to a group of users. You can't grant access to a particular user. That user has to be part of a group because this is part of the policy format. So you have this types of users and groups. Another type that you have is instance principals. So this is where you can make your compute resources or instances to be able to make API calls against your other OCI resources. So this then would be part of a dynamic group. So you have your regular groups of users, but you also have your dynamic groups with instances to make API calls against your different resources. So this dives a little bit more into the format. So you would add this user to, let's say, group A. And then from there, you would always allow access. You're never denying access. It's always denied by default. So you're allowing a group of users, so in this case, group A, to manage. This is the highest level of permissions, a certain resource, so the compute, in a certain compartment. So this group A can manage the compute resources in this compartment right here. Then you have this user who is a part of group B. So you're allowing group B to inspect compute resources in the compartment B right here. So to be able to inspect these resources, that is the level of permission that you granted with this policy. So this is a little bit more on policy syntax. So once again, you're allowing a group of users and a certain level of permissions. So this case manage, this is the highest. So you can see right here, this includes all permissions for the resource, or you can do inspect. So to list the resources, you can do read. So you can inspect plus the ability to get user metadata from the resource, or you can use it. So read plus ability to work with existing resources. So certain levels of access that you can grant to your group of users. And then you'd specify the resource. You can see some examples here, depending on the resource that you want to grant access to. And then in a certain compartment, and then you can get more granular with your where conditions. And the nice thing too is that whenever you're drafting your policies in OCI, there's the policy syntax builder. So it'll help you draft policy statements. It will have some common policy templates. And so it'll let you know the permission that's granting. And then from there, you can make any manual changes to that policy and also have the format listed as well in the console. And then there's also documentation to explore that will help draft these different policies. All right. Another thing to keep in mind as you're building out your different resources and then granting access to those different resources is how are you monitoring and managing your resources. So there's a few tools here to be aware of. So the first is your monitoring service. So a lot of your different resources like autonomous, compute, all of that are going to continuously emit metrics to the monitoring service. And so you can view this in the console or other monitoring tools. You can also set alarms based off those metrics. So I'll give you an example. So let's say for your autonomous database, you want to know when CPU utilization exceeds a certain threshold. So let's say 80%. So if it exceeds that threshold, you can be notified of when that occurs. So that's just one example. You can set different metrics and alarms for different services, but it helps you get a little bit more insight into what's going on with your resources. You also have logging, and this is nice to view all your different logs, and there's different types. So there's your service logs, audit logs, and more custom logs, so more for like applications or on-prem or stuff like that. So for your audit logs, this is more of high-level API calls or clicks in the console. So you can get a list of those different logs, kind of who did what and when, and you can search through your different compartments. You also have service logs that you can enable for your different resources. So maybe virtual cloud network, maybe your load balancer. And this might be useful to look into. So for your load balancer, there's two different types of log groups that you can enable for it. So one is access logs and the other one is error logs. And error logs especially might be useful to have enabled because if one of your backend servers is down or there's some kind of error going on with the service, then that will end up in your error log group and you can actually be notified of when that occurs and you can set different filters if there's a certain error that you want to focus on. So that's a high level overview of logging. We also have notifications and alarms. So as we saw with monitoring logging, it ties in with quite a few services. So this will help you stay up to date. And there's different protocols for or channels for being notified. So it could be email, Slack, PagerDuty, or a few other options. Then lastly, there's a tool called Resource Manager. So this is kind of more of Terraform as a service. It's going to help with automating the deployment of your infrastructure or your architecture. And then from there, you can also manage the state of that. So there's a state file that tracks the state of your different resources. So if something was manually changed in the console, Resource Manager will actually pick up on that with drift detection. So you can see what is expected in that state file, what it should be versus what was changed manually. So it's good for keeping track of the state of the infrastructure that you are creating. And with that, I will pass it over to Joey, who will be taking you through some of the other key services that you'll likely be working with in OCI. So networking, compute, storage, all of that. So with that, over to you, Joey.
Awesome. Thank you, Olivia. So we talked about some of the foundations of OCI, how OCI is structured. So we got a lay of the land for regions, availability domains, fault domains. We talked about some of the security features. One of the main ones is going to be identity and access management, giving people and resources permissions to actually do things within your tenancy. And we also covered a little bit of the monitoring and governance pieces that Olivia just went over. So once your users will have permission to provision resources and utilize resources within your tenancy, one of the first things that you might want to be setting up is your networking architecture. So the first of the core services we're going to go over and some of the foundational components of that service is going to be networking within OCI. And on the screen here, you can see are a couple of the main building blocks that you'll need to get started with building out your architecture. And the first is going to be your VCNs or virtual cloud networks. So these are going to be your private, customizable, software-defined networks that you will be setting up within an OCI region. So you'll define the CIDR range for this network, and then you'll be provisioning your resources as a part of this network. And that could be either IPv4 addresses or IPv6 if you've chosen to enable that. Your virtual cloud network, as mentioned, is a regional construct, and it can be further subdivided into subnets, which will have their own individual areas of configuration as well. So if I want to, let's say, have a section of my network be constrained to a single availability domain, I could have an availability domain specific subnet. If I want a section of my network to also span every availability domain within that region, I could have a regional subnet as well. Also, factoring in some security aspects to your network here, you could also do a public versus a private subnet. So if I want to have a private subnet so that my resources don't have public IPs, I could have a private subnet and a public subnet as well. Then, depending on the type of traffic that I want to enable to and from my network, there are different gateways I'll have at my disposal for those different use cases. So I'll have internet gateways, NAT gateways, dynamic routing gateways, and service gateways, all with their own unique use case. So internet gateway, inbound and outbound connections to the internet. NAT gateway, just outbound connections and receiving responses, but no inbound connections. Dynamic routing gateway, that has many different use cases. Maybe I want to connect to my on-premise resources. I could have a dynamic routing gateway provision for that. Maybe I want to communicate to other networks that I have within OCI. Maybe that's within the same region with local peering or a different region with remote peering. Dynamic routing gateway is also good for that. Then lastly, the service gateway, that's going to let you connect to public OCI services, but without having to go over the public internet. Instead, that'll go through OCI's backbone there. So different ones at your disposal. And then lastly, a couple of different firewall options you'll have for your network as well. So you'll have your security lists versus your network security groups. Each of these will have ingress and egress rules that you will input. The only difference here is the security list will apply to the subnet level. So every resource in that subnet will be subject to that security list. Versus a network security group, that will be at the VNIC level. So I could have groups of instances that maybe reside in different subnets or different networks. I could have them still have a similar security posture and be subject to this network security groups rules. So doesn't have to be in the same subnet for a network security group, does have to be in the same subnet for a security list. So both options there.
And one of the nice things about as you're building out your different networking components in OCI is there is a tool called the Network Visualizer that will help you visualize all your different networking components, how in general they're being routed, and also the security routing. So you'd see maybe your security lists and your network security groups and all the routing for that.
Yeah, that's a great tool to use when you get in there just to give you a visual representation of everything. So highly recommend using that. And if you're going to join any of the other sessions, if we have a networking focused one, we'll use that in our demonstrations. And once you have your network architecture set up, you can start to deploy different services that you may use to run your applications. And the first piece we're going to go over is compute. And there are a couple different types of deployments you can choose from for this as well, depending on your use case. From left to right here on the screen, it'll kind of go from most management handled by the customer, leased by Oracle, all the way over to most of the infrastructure management being handled by Oracle and less handled by the customer. So if we start on the left, you have your full dedicated bare metal servers. So good for high performance. They're highly isolated. Since you have that full dedicated server at your disposal, right, you can utilize all of the resources for that bare metal server. Also useful if you want to do something like bring your own hypervisor and use that for that bare metal server as well. Then you have your virtual machines. So it's utilizing that hypervisor to virtualize that bare metal server into smaller VMs. It's good for a wide variety of use cases, small to large. You're going to have a lot of flexibility in shape, flexibility in image, depending on the type of series that you want to run. So it's good for most use cases, maybe not quite as intensive as a full bare metal server, but there are still very high performance virtual machines that you have at your disposal as well. It's just going to have the hypervisor already there virtualizing the environment for you. Then if you're going to utilize a microservice-based architecture, if you're utilizing containers for anything, we have a couple different services that will help you both store and manage your container deployments. So we have our container registry service for storage, and we also have our Oracle Container Engine for Kubernetes to manage and deploy those containerized workloads. Then lastly, at the far right, let's say you want to run applications without worrying about the underlying infrastructure at all, right? We have what's called Oracle Functions, which is our serverless application development platform. So just worrying about scripting the code and not worrying about the infrastructure used to run that application. What's nice about this as well is it's only charged per execution. So you're not going to have to pay for any resources that are provisioned but not being used, right? This is if this function gets triggered, then you're just charged for the duration of that function's output. Now, once you know how you want to run your application, you know the network that's going to be a part of, let's look at ways we can store additional information for our workloads. So similarly, like with the compute, you're going to have different options for different use cases. If you want this high performance, low latency storage option, you'll have your local NVMe SSD. That's going to be directly installed on your instance, which is why it has that low latency aspect to it. Good for big data, OLTP, and high performance workloads. Then you have your block volumes, which is going to be one of the more flexible storage options. You'll have detachable storage volumes that you can use that will persist regardless if it's attached to an instance or not. You can use this to expand the storage for your instances that you have running within OCI. It's good for application development. It's good for application deployment and really any apps that require SAN-like features like database or VMware. Then we have file storage. So it's an enterprise-grade file storage service. And the main use case for this is if you need a shared file system for your application. It's highly, highly scalable, enterprise-grade. And if you need that, it will provide all of the capabilities that you would need for that kind of workload. So EBS, HPC as well. Lastly, on the far right, we have object storage and archive storage, which are kind of two flavors of the same thing. Object storage, you can just retrieve instantaneously. Archive storage will take some time to retrieve those files. And because it takes a little more time, right, it's going to be a little bit cheaper as well. So it's for any of your unstructured data, logs, images, videos, database backups as well. So all those can be stored in either of these options. There's also some automation you can put into place where you could have it be within object storage for a certain period of time. And if it's not accessed frequently, you can have it get moved to archive storage after a certain number of days as well. So good for like long-term audit storage, for example. And lastly, we're going to go over database and then a couple newer offerings associated with Oracle database. So depending on how much management you would like to take on for your database workload, you're going to have a range of deployment options here as well. So more customer managed, co-managed, and then fully managed being by Oracle. So you can see the arrow out here at the bottom, more automation as you go towards the right. Your highest level of control, right? That's going to be your Oracle database running on compute. That could be on VM or bare metal. So we talked about those two different ways in which you could run your different workloads. You could have Oracle database installed on either. You could still utilize all of the different tools like DataGuard to help secure your database workloads here, but you will have to manage most of the infrastructure associated with that. Co-managed, like Oracle-based database service and Oracle Exadata database service, you will have a lot of different tools at your disposal to make running and managing your database deployments a little bit easier. So things to help with tuning and patching. You'll have automated backups, lifecycle management for your database workloads. So all that's kind of included and makes it easier to run these with a little bit less involved than your customer managed database on compute. And then if you want to have all of the patching, scaling, tuning, tooling already there for you, you have the Oracle Autonomous Database option. So one of the most hands-off ways to run your database workloads. And there are different flavors of this as well. So if you want data warehousing, there's a column optimized version of the database. If you want transaction processing. There's a row optimized version. There's also a version that's optimized for JSON workloads as well. And when I mentioned tooling, right, there's a couple pieces automatically installed and ready to go for your autonomous database. So you could use our low-code development platform that's already ready to run on the database. There's machine learning workbooks there available to you as well. So really the most hands-off approach here and highly performant. Now we're going to go over a couple services that are somewhat new, but is going to go along with your database workloads. The first one of our multi-cloud offerings, which is Oracle Database at Azure. So this is allowing you to run your Oracle database workloads in Azure regions, right? So for different regions, there are direct connections between Oracle data centers and Azure data centers. So it makes it very easy to run those split stack workloads with low latency between your app and database layers. You still get a unified area to look at service metrics, events, logs, all that can be shipped to Azure as well. And then there are no egress fees for that data movement as well. There are also a couple other offerings out. I don't know if you've recently looked at the announcement via CloudWorld. There was the announcement for working with AWS. So we have some additional capabilities there. And then we also have some abilities to work with GCP. One more new service that goes along with your database workloads will also be Oracle AI Vector Search. So with your unstructured data, there are going to be different features or characteristics of that data that may be traditionally typical to categorize and search upon. But with vector search, right, there are different capabilities embedded into Oracle 23 AI to allow you to generate vector embeddings from your unstructured data. It'll have data types for your vector search. It will have vector indexes to quickly look at those different aspects of your structured data and allow you to search upon multiple features that might not be there with traditional metadata. And also a full generative AI pipeline that you could use to process and vectorize the data. So awesome new feature that you can use with the newest version of Oracle Database. Highly recommend, especially if you're utilizing some of the new generative AI services as well. Okay. So that quickly covers kind of all of an overview of all the core OCI components. Now I'm going to take you into the console to do a quick demonstration, give you an overview of how to navigate, and then we'll look at maybe provisioning compute instances or looking at some different capabilities of identity and access management. So give me 1 second here. All right, so you should be able to see the OCI console now. And from here, this is going to be the page that you see when you first log into OCI. So after you have someone has created a user for you, you're able to log in via SSO or whatever you have set up for logging in and authenticating your user. This is the OCI homepage. And the main goal of the homepage is really to allow you to access things more quickly. So here you have service links. So I could pin things that I use frequently. Like I have instances and virtual cloud networks here, so I can navigate directly to those. I have recently visited, so within my recent sessions, I can navigate to any of these services that I was just at. And then I also have a recommended section. So this doesn't have to do with my identity access management permissions. This is basically suggestions that OCI is giving you based off of a profile that you create. So if I went in here and hit update, I could go down and say, well, I'm more of a developer. I do some low code as well. Also do some web apps. I don't really work with databases very often, so I could save changes, and it gives you different recommendations based off of the profile you selected. You'll still need permissions to access all of this stuff, but it will give you the direct link to there. So if you do have permissions, you'll be able to use that. Below that, you have some quick starts. So if I want to quickly create some different deployments, it will take me there, give me some guidance, give me an estimation for how long that deployment will take. And I can navigate to any of these. So if I want to deploy a WordPress website, a landing zone to get me some of the foundational security components, low code application development, like we mentioned, running on autonomous database. I can navigate to those there. For individual resources, there's some quick launches here as well, basically decided upon by Oracle as the most common things that people may want to use and provision quickly, such as a VM, utilizing a network, the networking wizard to provision your network, creating an autonomous database, either ATP or ADW. So it just lets you navigate to those quickly. And then if you want to do other learning or exploration, you have all of that down here as well. So if you want to learn more about identity domains, like Olivia mentioned, so that's again the new complete end-to-end identity and access management platform, merging IDCS with local IAM capabilities and making it easy to manage in one place. You can go to documentation there and learn more. Similarly with Apex Resource Manager, I think this is the documentation homepage. And you have some other tours you can take, developer tools, etc. For anything within OCI, you could also utilize the search bar here. So that could be as broad as a service category, or it could be as specific as an OCID for an individual resource. So you could utilize this, and that also makes it easy to navigate to different resources. And then if we look in the top right, you could see US East Ashburn. This is where we selected the region we're going to be working in. So Olivia went over regions, availability domains, and default domains. When you're working in OCI, you want to be aware of the region in which you are working in. This is the physical location for which your resources will be deployed. If I hit this arrow, I can see all of the other regions for which my tenancy is subscribed to. So remember, your tenancy is your overall OCI account. And then you can subscribe to different regions where you can deploy your resources. And then you can manage them through here if you want to remove some or subscribe to more.
And this is also important to check too, because once again, if you ever can't find a resource, you always want to check your compartment and the region that you're working in. Because I've run into that issue a few times where I was panicking, I can't find this resource, and I would check either the compartment or the region. So you just want to make sure that if that happens, you're checking both of those.
Yeah, we can actually take a look at that right now too. So if we go to the top left, this is the general navigation menu. So this will give you all the different service categories. And if you click into any of these, it'll give you details on the actual services within those categories. So if I went into something like instances, right, I want to be aware of the region, physical location that I'm in, as well as the compartment. So this is the logical grouping that is created based off of the access boundary. So do I have access to resources within this particular compartment? So if I go down to Vision Corp, I go into infrastructure, you can see now I can view these instances versus that last compartment, there were no instances provisioned. So here, since I'm in Ashburn, I'm looking at the infrastructure compartment, I can see these 5 different instances. If I switched over to Phoenix, for example, I have nothing provisioned in Phoenix that's stored within this compartment. So physical location and logical grouping based off your access boundary. And then if I went up to the overview section of this here, it'll give me a high-level view of the service and give me some metrics that are aggregated across all of those 5 instances that I have within here. And then if I went to any instance in particular, you would get additional metrics on things like performance and memory and all that stuff. So more details specific to this instance, CPU utilization, memory utilization, read and write IO. But thank you for pointing that out, Olivia. And then I would like to show a little bit of the identity and access management piece here as well. So we do have this top left menu. Identity and security is going to be located down here. And you're going to see identity is going to be the first section in this category. So I select identity. I'll get an overview, explain what identity domains are, helps you learn more about setting up MFA, syncing with Active Directory, so some common things that you may want to do once you get started with an OCI and set up your users and groups and permissions and all of that. And then here are kind of further navigation within the identity service. So you can see policies are located at this level. So you don't have to be in a particular domain to create policies. When you write a policy, you'll specify the domain that that policy will apply to. Same with compartments. Compartments are going to be across your tenancy. You don't have to be within a specific domain for that. But if I select domains, you could see we have a production domain and we have our overall identity cloud service domain. We come in here, this is where we get to see our users, groups, dynamic groups, any integrated applications, any Oracle Cloud services where I want to manage permissions from other security components will be in here as well. But I would create users within a domain. I could create a user here, first name, last name, email. And then once I have that in here, I could immediately add them to different groups. And if I add them to a group, they're then going to have permissions associated with that group. Right? So if I have a policy that references IDCS administrators, for example, if I added this user to this user would then have the permissions associated with the IDCS administrators group. If I wanted to create my own group, I could do that from here as well. I could hit create group. And then now instead of adding a user to a group from that level, I could create a group and then add a group of users, a bunch of users to this group as well. I could select multiple and say these 4 are my IDCS admin. I could create this group and these 4 users would now be a part of it. If we go back up to policies, I can say, let's go to the root. When I create a policy, there's going to be a couple different ways to make this a little quicker for you. So let's say I want to create a policy for managing functions. Manage functions. Allows admin to manage functions in Vision Corp. So I select the compartment where I want this policy to be stored. And then this is where I can build out the actual policy and create the permissions themselves. So there are a bunch of different policy use cases and templates that I can use within a policy builder. So I could go in and select any of these. So let's say, I'll do functions in a second, but let's just show like compute management, right? Based off of compute management, there are lots of different templates I can use to give a different set of permissions to my users. If I went to functions, I think the first one is manage functions. So we'll just use the let users create, deploy, and manage functions and applications. Gives you a description of what that means. And then these are all the policy statements associated with those permissions. Right? You can see group name and location aren't specified. So I could come in, select a group. So I'll say within the IDCS domains, I want my admin to be able to create, deploy, and manage functions and applications within the, say, Vision Corp compartment. Right? See, all of that gets populated for you. So now my Vision Corp admin can create, deploy, and manage functions and applications for all resources within the Vision Corp compartment. Now, let's say I don't want to use all of these permissions, or I want to edit some of these and make them more granular, for example. I can always switch into this manual editor. So allow group. I can go in and manage any of these and remove any of these if I wanted to. I can make them more granular with that where condition that Olivia mentioned. So I can say like where tag equals production, for example. And I could add that to any of these where that's needed. I could add additional statements, or I could remove any of these as well. That's the quick start on creating a policy for any of those groups and users. And once again, any user that's a part of the VC admins group would now get these permissions. They would not have had them before, and now they would have them after this policy has been created. If I didn't want someone to have these permissions, I could remove them from the VC admins group. If I wanted to, I could add them to the VC admins group. Okay. And now I see that we've had some Q&A going. FAW license for underneath the group.
Renee is trying to use the policies in such a way it doesn't merely refer to access to a particular application or service, but can relate to the underlying role that the individual might have in that service. So what came to mind was someone having, you give someone access as a user to autonomous database through a policy, but that wouldn't affect what role they had in autonomous database. The admin for the autonomous database would set the requirements against the people coming in for them to use autonomous database either as a administrator or as a user and a user of different tools. That's the way I understand that question, but referring not to a database, but an FAW licensed role underneath. So I think you're not using the tool, you're not thinking of the tool properly. I see what you're trying to do, but I think you should focus on the FAW tools and not on the policies. Use the policies to manage the group of people who have access to FAW, and then use the FAW tools to control.
Yeah, I think that's correct, because this would be the permissions I'm showing within OCI here. That would be, let's say I want to provision a Fusion Analytics warehouse, or be able to stop it, start it, edit any of the details surrounding the performance of that warehouse, versus users within the service itself is still managed within the service. So whoever's the admin of that service would have the ability to work with permissions inside of it, like the business user, or having read-only permissions to different dashboards and things. That's all still managed within the service itself. But anything having to do with running or hosting that service will be covered with the permissions that I went over within identity and access management. And then the next one, when you apply.
By the way, that doesn't mean you couldn't do it. It's just it's not the recommended way to do it. And I don't have any idea how you'd have to have so many different groups, right, for the different users. So it would almost have a individual group policy, and even that wouldn't affect what was going on inside FAW. So.
Yep. And then,
Joey, there was a question on difference between IDCS and IAM. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so IDCS has been merged with local OCI IAM if you've been using it previously. So now all the capabilities that you would have had with IDCS, you will now have within the Oracle Identity and Access Management service. It's just with additional functionality, so it's all managed in one place. You wouldn't have to federate OCI with IDCS. It's now kind of combined together. Thank you all for joining. Are there any closing statements from the Oracle team? Randy, Olivia, Taylor?
Just one more thing. So our next session is Oracle Cloud Observability Management and the Customer Advantage at 10 a.m. Pacific on October 7th. So we'll cover the design strategy for Oracle's integrated observability and management cloud solution. So we hope to see you all there. Thanks, everyone.